Okay, and today's going to be Interpret Timelines, Lesson 7 in Unit 2. And we'll go ahead and get started here. Okay, so by the time we finish up this lesson, you're going to be able to visualize events using a timeline and identify historical trends. So really goes along, it's in many ways a visual way to interpret cause and effect, because you're going to see events as they fall on a timeline. And they can get really specific, they can be really vague, they can be, address different intervals of time. They may be set up in 5-year increments or 10 centuries even. There's, long world history timelines that start at the beginning of civilization and things like that. So let's take a look at our audio here, see what they say about timeline.
The ability to interpret timelines is an especially valuable tool when studying history. Timelines present sequences of events in a visual manner. Visualizing events in this way enables you to determine not only the order in which the events occur, but also the intervals that fall between these events. Because timelines show key events in sequence, it is possible to identify historical trends that connect those events. As with other areas of the GED test, questions about interpreting timelines will test your ability to interpret information at various depth of knowledge levels through the use of complex reading skills and thinking skills.
Yep, there it is. So, and as I mentioned, I'm going to try to find some timelines for you guys to help with those events that we talk about, particularly really through this unit, right? This is where we really got into history. So, getting things in order from, say, like the French and Indian War, the 7 Years War, and then the American Revolution, and the ratification of the Constitution and things like that. And when you actually have a visual, line to look at, it really helps. Thinking about order of events and cause and effect. If you can visualize it, just the same way we look at a map or we look at a table, those timelines are really, really helpful to understand history. And then right here we have, as I mentioned in our text, the fight for women's suffrage, the fight for the women's vote. And I was having my own technical difficulties the other day, and when you guys were talking about the I think it was the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. And I was going to mention, if I had actually been online there, about even though it had secured the vote for slaves living in, or former slaves and freedmen living in the South, the 15th Amendment did not secure the vote for women. So there was still this fight to be had, and we see the timeline here. So you see on our text box where it says the benchmark dates on a timeline show the equivalent intervals into which the full time span of the timeline is divided. In this case, the timeline shows the period from 1890 to 1920, divided into 5-year intervals. So about a span of about 30 years between 1890 and 1920. And then on the timeline itself, right, we have it ticked off in 5-year increments. And our text box B says this timeline illustrates some of the historic events that occurred during the years leading to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted U.S. women the right to vote. So, several things happened, right? For one, some states had already started adopting women's suffrage without really a push, without the necessity. So, like it says here in 1893, Colorado adopted women's suffrage. So they're already like, okay, there wasn't a big aggressive push for them to go ahead and do that. Same thing, Utah joins the Union. When they join the Union, they are offering the women the right to vote as they enter. Idaho in 1895 is another state. Then Washington State adopts women's suffrage in 1910. Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona adopted in 1912. 1914, Nevada and Montana adopt it. 1970, New York women gain the right to vote. Arkansas women are allowed to vote in primary elections in 1917. Then in 1919, the Senate finally passes the 19th Amendment. So then the ratification of that amendment begins. And so by August 26, 1920, 3/4 of the state legislators had ratified the 19th Amendment, and American women finally won full voting rights in 1920. So you figure, can't remember the exact year, the 15th Amendment supposedly gave everybody the right to vote, or at least in its language. That was like 1868, I think, or yeah, somewhere right around there. So there was still this fight for the vote. And Sasha Gay, you want to read our text below here?
Okay. Beginning in the second half of the 1800s, many women in the United States worked to gain the right to vote. Organizations such as the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association worked to gain this right through a national constitutional amendment and the individual state constitutional amendments. Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1906, served as a leader in the National Woman Suffrage Association. After a number of states granted suffrage, women began to use their new voting rights to once again push for a national amendment. In 1920, the 19th Amendment granted women throughout the United States the right to vote.
All right, there we go. So that's give you a little more background and introduces Susan B. Anthony as one of the leaders. That's a name you're probably familiar with. And so, we're doing that sort of combination like we've been doing, some text and a map, or text and a table. So, with our questions, and when you get to your tests, you're going to see, the combination where you'll be referencing either or both in order to answer questions. Okay, let's move over to our quiz. Okay, so Lesson 7, Unit 2, our Interpret Timeline quiz. And here it says that timelines typically show a trend in events. By reviewing each event and the events that occurred before and after each one, you should be able to see the trend. And of course, they're usually going to be about a specific topic. You're not going to have all of history on a timeline, with all the relevant events. That would be way too muddled. So like this one, we have one for women's suffrage. We're going to talk about World War I in a little bit, so we'll have some specific, events of World War I on a timeline. So, and of course, tracing those events through, you can see a trend where, starting in the 1890s, we start seeing states offering the vote to women, and including them in voting, and then that trend, kind of snowballs until we finally get to the 19th Amendment in 1919, and then women are voting in 1920. All right, Tracy, would you like to read question 1 for us and answer it?
Yes. Which of the following inferences can you make about Susan B. Anthony? A. She voted in the 1920 presidential election. B. She opposed anti-slavery and temperance amendment. amendment. She traveled and lectured on the importance of women's suffrage. She lived in one of the first states to grant women and women the right to vote. She I think she traveled and lectured on the importance of women's suffrage.
Yep. C as in cat, right? So you can make that inference knowing that she was a leader in the women's suffrage movement. And that it really details it. We could kind of assume that she probably voted in the 1920 presidential election. I'm not sure which state she was actually from, so she may have actually voted before that, though. So that you can't really make that assertion, not knowing, getting the information of where she's from. But certainly, we could definitely say that she, as a leader in the suffrage movement, was traveling and lecturing on the importance of the women's right to vote. Okay, and a new timeline, important dates in America's Jim Crow period. So Jim Crow is basically the era of segregation in the United States after the Civil War. And we have a timeline here of events. Basically, another trend, right? We see the Civil War ends and the 13th Amendment ends slavery in America. Also, you have to be careful because it'll bounce back and forth to make room for things. A lot of times a timeline will be double-sided like that. And this, goes from we got 100 years here, 1860 to 1960. And in increments of about 10 years. And then we have the specific years with our text here. So it actually starts with 1863, right, with the Emancipation Proclamation, then the 13th Amendment in 1865, 1868, 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal rights to former enslaved workers. 1865 to 77 is the era of Reconstruction, where the Union occupied the South and was helping to rebuild it and trying to integrate that back into the United States, right? In between that 1870, the 15th Amendment, that's what I was talking about, granting the African Americans the right to vote in 1870. Of course, even then, it would have been African American men, not women. 1875, Civil Rights Act passes. And you see this trend, right? All that's pretty good stuff. You're thinking, okay, making progress. It's trending up. But then 1883, the Civil Rights Act is overturned. 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which I think we're going to talk about here in a minute, and I'm going to give you some more details on that, was a court case that set a precedent that separate but equal facilities for the races. So that was really a landmark case that allowed for segregation in 1896. 1913, the federal government supports segregation. So President Wilson fails to keep campaign promises to African American voters. Finally, we have this period here where segregation continued, and in 1947 and 48, Truman ended discrimination in the U.S. government. So there was discrimination, of course. There was segregation in the military between white and black troops, and he was very unpopular. This is where you get the Southern Democrat, right? Truman was a Democrat. You have what is called the Dixiecrats, are still part of the Democrat Party, but they're basically splitting off because they didn't like this idea of desegregation and this anti-discrimination movement that's Truman is starting to support. And then in 54, we've actually talked about the Brown versus Board of Education, that other landmark Supreme Court ruling that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, Christiana, would you like to read the text below here?
Okay. Following the Civil War, most southern states, as well as some border states, and
Enacted?
enacted law that denies basic human rights to newly freed African Americans. A white minister, popularly known as Jim Crow,
Jim Crow.
Jim Crow won backface and hugged characters of African American. The term Jim Crow involved to compass the law, customs, and personal behavior that white people displayed in their segregation and degradation of African Americans. Jim Crow laws and practice in the South represented the basis
Racial.
And the word is it
Hickory.
Hierarchy.
Oh, hierarchy.
Yeah, like a stratified system.
Hierarchy. Hierarchy that was prevalent during the decades following the Civil War, with white people at the top and African American at the bottom. For example, during
just 1 second. That's the hierarchy, right? So white people are supposed to be on top, and basically any other people of color is going to be under that. But you see, that's a stratification. All right, go ahead.
For example, during this time, where am I? Okay, during Jim Crow's period, an African American person was expected to move from a front seat to a train or a bus to a seat in the back. When an African person boarded segregated drinking fountains. Segregated drinking fountains were common. Supporters of Jim Crow and Russia segregation believed that if the two races share public facility, it might promote social inequality, leading they fear to the destruction of American culture. Also, should I continue?
Yeah, go ahead.
Also common during this time were separate hospitals, prisons, churches, cemetery, public and private schools, public restrooms, and other public accommodations. In general, the facility for African American were quite inferior, less conveniently located, much older, smaller, and that year. In many locations, there simply were no facility available for African Americans, including no place to including no place to eat or sit, or no public restrooms.
Yeah, and then
The question.
Go ahead.
African American from all states received the right to vote years after the Civil War ended.
And I think Etta, she put the answer in the chat for us, so it's 5 years after.
Yeah, I looked at the timeline up there.
Yeah, there you go. That's what the timeline's for, right? It also helps you to do that math. So it was 1865 when the Civil War ended, and then 1870, right, is when the 15th Amendment granted African Americans the right to vote. So a 5-year span. So number 2 there is 5. F-I-V-E. I also want to point out, another word might be less familiar with. Minstrel is like it's an old like medieval word, but it's basically, a singer and entertainer. So, this guy name was Jim Crow, and he wore, blackface, and he mocked African Americans and everything. So that's where that term came from for those segregation laws and discrimination, was from his, his depiction of African Americans. So yeah, number 2 is 5. And then we have our same passage there. Let's see. All right, Ed is jumping on it here. So the year was notable because practices of racial segregation was supported in the U.S. government. So the year was 1913, right? And it was right there. Woodrow Wilson had, kind of campaigned on some civil rights issues. And then, of course, he failed to keep his promises. So the federal government at that time was still supporting segregation. It wasn't until we get to like the era of Truman after World War II that, that we start seeing some actual change. So 1913 for number 3. And let's see here.
I have the answer number 2 again.
Number 2 is 5. So make sure you spell it out. I think if you just put the number in there, it'll count it incorrect. So F-I-V-E.
I definitely put 5 too.
Yeah, make sure you write it out. 1913, though, that will be correct because it's a year, right? So we usually don't spell out years. So 1913 will work for number 3. And let's see, Etta, you want to read number 4 for us?
Okay, it says white citizens who practiced racial segregation during the Jim Crow period did not want social equality between the races.
Yeah, and equality is your answer there. So it says right there in that second paragraph, share public facilities, blah, blah, blah. It might promote social equality. And that's what they were afraid of. It was easy to continue to suppress African-American rights and social equality. We talked about that, the view, particularly in the South, but this was all over. It wasn't just Southern states that were guilty of segregation and discrimination at this time. So, and it was a means to continue to, suppress African Americans. That was something before when we talked about the 15th Amendment. There was this sudden, boom of African American voters really early on in that era of Reconstruction, and then it dropped like after the 1880s because of death threats and threats of violence towards Black voters and local laws. So they would say stuff like, well, you have to be literate to vote, or there would be a poll tax. You can imagine going to vote today and they're like, oh, it'll be $100. they would put all these obstacles in the way to prevent the African American voter showing up at the polls. So anyway, yeah. So 4 is equality, and then finally, let's go back to the top. Sasha Gay, you want to take number 5 for us? Finish us out here.
Okay. Maintaining separate but equal public facilities between the races was ensured by the Supreme Court case.
Plessy versus Ferguson.
Yeah, Plessy versus Ferguson. And
In 1896.
there you go. Yeah, it was 1896. So let me see here. Plessy, Plessy, and Ferguson, Ferguson. And Homer Plessy was mixed race. He was half African American. And this happened around the New Orleans area, I think. It was in Louisiana. I think it actually, the event occurred in 1890. And he had boarded a train and was sitting in the white section of the train and was told that he had to move. So there was a federal suit against, I don't know if that was like the owner of the train line or who Ferguson was exactly, but basically they took it to court, saying that this violated his rights to have this, separate cars for black folks and white folks, and they lost the case. And the Supreme Court upheld at that point, right? We had this precedent set by the Supreme Court that if you had reasonable accommodations for African Americans, you could be, it was separate but equal. So, as long as you had a water fountain, like I was saying here, a water fountain or a hospital or a school or, a train car, as long as you had that available for African Americans, then you're separate but equal. The problem was, though, it was never equal, right? Always the facilities for African Americans was always, it didn't have the same quality, that lacked funding. And, of course, that was a big problem. And that's where Brown versus Board of Education, revisits that case much later down the road, but then overturns that ruling. So there's no more such thing as separate but equal. It is just equal. All right, so that was 5, Plessy versus Ferguson. So let's submit our answers here. Okay, 1 was C as in cat. 2 was 5 years after the Civil War. 3 was 1913, 1913. 4 was equality, EQUALITY. And then finally, number 5, Plessy versus Ferguson, PLESSY, Ferguson, FERGUSON. Okay, and we'll move over to the workbook. I think we're going to get into some world wars here. And then presenting our information again, timelines are visual representations of a sequence of events. A timeline features equivalent intervals to divide the time period shown into smaller segments. The dots or buttons placed along the timeline indicate the actual dates at which the events shown on the timeline occur. Specific details can aid in discovering historical trends that link the events in a timeline. Remember that a trend is not always the culmination of all events on a timeline. A general trend may occur over time, but trends can occur also during the short term. For example, the last few months before an election could show smaller trends, whereas evaluating which political party has control of the White House or Congress over the past several decades could reveal a different trend. So yeah, your lens can change, and sometimes events are compressed, right? Like the things leading up to the January 6th insurrection, right? That's a fairly compressed timeline, whereas other events take longer to unfold. So let's see here. Edda, would you like to read the second?
So when the national, starting there.
Yep.
When the National Women's Suffrage Association published the Blue Book, the group intended to dispute objections to women having the right to vote. For example, one objection to women's suffrage was that it would double the number of people voting who were ignorant. The Blue Book cited statistics proving that more girls than boys were graduating from high school. Ensuring equal suffrage would increase the number of educated voters. Another objection was that voting would stop women from caring for their families. The Blue Book argued that the act of voting took little time and that most women could find time to read newspapers and educate themselves on issues before voting. Some people believed that women were too emotional and sentimental and could not be trusted with the ballot. The authors of the Blue Book pointed out several instances of men in government who had made emotional or sentimental decisions about war and economic policy instead of relying on logic.
Yeah, so it's sort of like a fact book, to help show that this is just ridiculous. It's crazy to think at that time they're thinking, no, you can't leave your house even long enough to vote because you have to take care of your family. And also, right, and that also tells you something about the culture of the day and the understanding of what the women's role was, right? That today, women are in the workforce and all this stuff. But even the thought of women having jobs outside the home, that really shows you what life was like for women at that time. And then the whole thing that it's going to increase the amount of ignorant people voting, and again showing you the way women were looked at, then proving, which is really interesting here, is that statistic that actually more girls than boys were graduating from high school, right? Because of course at that time a lot of men are entering the workforce at the age of 15, 16, so they're not completing an education, whereas women are actually going through, because they're not entering the workforce, they're going to be homemakers largely, so they're actually getting better educated. The irony there that that no, it's not going to be more ignorant people. These people are actually graduating high school, or they're getting a longer education. So it's that was one of the things that really helped promote the women's suffrage movement. All right, so let's start here with our workbook. And we are, so it's basically the same timeline that we saw before on the women's suffrage movement, right? That 30-year span between when Utah joins the Union to the 1920, when Congress ratifies the 19th Amendment and American women finally win full voting rights. And it says, for making assumptions that you can assume that all events on a timeline relate to a trend of some type. If the relationship of the events is not clear at first, review the events, then draw conclusions. So hopefully, whenever you encounter a timeline, it'll have some type of title with it that's going to tip you off exactly what you should be looking for. If not, then you might start piecing together, like if it was about the Civil War, you start seeing dates, 1865 into the Civil War, or going back to 1861 or 1860, the secession of southern states. So just make sure that you are looking for those clues, so you understand what the timeline is, what's significant about the timeline. Let's see, Sasha Gay, you want to answer question 1 for us?
What can you infer about the authors of the Blue Book? A, they were relatively uninformed about the issues. B, they were amused by the objections raised to the women's suffrage. C, even if an objection was true, they denied it. D, they used a logical, methodical approach to A.
D. You're cutting out there a little bit towards the end, but D as in dog. So the blue book actually contained facts and they approach it in a logical, methodical way to win the argument, right? By showing us we actually have more women who are staying in school longer. This idea that there's and then the argument that not every decision that men in government are making aren't sound and logical, that they're just as susceptible to emotion as women and things like that. So D is in dog for number 1. And let's see, Tracy, would you like to read number 2 for us?
Yes. Number 2. How many states had adopted women suffrage before publication of the Blue Book? B, 9.
Yep,
9.
9. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead there. Yeah, B, 9, that's the correct answer. So if we went back to our timeline, you can count them off. So Utah, Idaho, Washington, California, Oregon, Kansas, Arizona, Nevada, Montana, right? So 9 states had actually went ahead and secured the women's right to vote before the publication of the Blue Book. And we see right here in 1917, right, that's when the Blue Book was distributed. Okay. So number 2 is B. Boy. Let's see. I'm going to read here. So we talk about World War I here. So World War I, also known as WW1, the First World War, the Great War, or the War to End All Wars, was a world conflict lasting from 1914 to 1919, with fighting lasting until 1918. A Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, setting in motion a war that included, among other atrocities, the century's first aerial large-scale bombing and the first large-scale civilian massacres. Europe's powers aligned themselves after the assassination, a move which escalated the conflicts into war. The Allies, chiefly Britain, Russia, and France, fought against the Central Powers, primarily Germany, Turkey, and Austria-Hungary. The war spread, with Europe turning to its friends and colonies for aid. Britain was determined to keep its colonial territories, and feared that unless it entered the war, its rival Germany would control Western Europe. The United States joined the war in 1917 when President Woodrow Wilson called on Americans to make the world safe for democracy. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, forced Germany to accept responsibility for the war and ordered it to pay costly reparations. The war brought to an end the Austro-Hungarian and German empires. World War I, there's entire history classes just about World War I, and the start of World War I is so complicated. We look at the assassination of Franz Ferdinand as it's really just the straw that broke the camel's back. There was so much going on at that time. But a big part of it was this feeling of nationalism that had gripped all of these countries that were involved. So in Britain, in nationalism, this idea of having this, super patriotism and super proud of your nation. And that was all over Europe. Everybody was really identifying with their country, whether you're German or Turkish or Russian. You know, there was this idea, particularly like in Britain and France and places like that. That's why, you know, a few years ago, when Donald Trump got up and was like, oh, you know, there's nothing wrong with the idea of nationalism, you know, and a bunch of historians were like, hold up, you know, nothing wrong necessarily with the word, but there is a history behind nationalism that's very violent that you need to consider. So that was part of it. And then alliances were a huge part of it. So, you know, like Britain, France, and Russia were all aligned. The Austria-Hungarian Empire, Germany, so when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, he was the heir to the throne of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. And that's when that empire declared war on Serbia. And then they call it the July Crisis, because then everybody started declaring war on each other because of these alliances. So Serbia was marginally aligned with Britain and Russia and France. So Britain turned around and was like, oh, you know, Austria-Hungary is going to invade or going to start war with Serbia. Well, we're going to start, you know, we're going to go to war with you. We declare war on you. Germany is like, oh, you're going to declare war on Austria-Serbia? Well, Germany's going to declare war on Britain. And it just cascaded, right? Until everybody in Europe was involved in this war. So that's kind of what we get into here on the timeline. Assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Austria declares war on Serbia, Germany declares war on Russia, Germany declares war on France, invades Belgium, Britain declares war on Germany. The Battle of Marne begins in September. You know, it was just this whole set of events that led to it. And there was this thought, that was the other part of nationalism, was this martial spirit that had really grabbed a lot of Europe, where there was an interest in military culture. And, you know, it was around this time where we get the Boy Scouts that kind of sprung from that idea of military culture and instilling certain discipline and ideas in the youth. And there was also a big thought that, oh, we're going to go to war in, you know, here in the summer, and we're going to be home by Christmas. That, you know, they just thought this was, you know, we're going to take care of business. We're going to be home. 5 years later, there's millions dead. So Britain, of course, then Turkey enters the war on Germany's side. The first Zeppelin raid, right? Like the big blimps were used to raid Britain and bomb Britain. Allied troops land in Gallipoli. This is in 1915 and on April 25th. Here's an important one for the American entrance in the war. The Lusitania passenger liner is sunk by a German U-boat, and that had American passengers on it. So there was this push after that for America to enter the war on the side, of course, of Britain and France. Then May 23rd, Italy declares war on Germany and Austria. August 5th, Germany captures Warsaw. December 19th, the Allies evacuate Gallipoli. And then on to 1916, in February, the start of the Battle of the Verdun, British forces surrendered to Turkey. Start of the Brusilov offensive. Start of the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the most intense battles of the war. End of the Brusilov offensive. First use of tanks in mass at the Somme. And it just keeps going on. So no need, I think, to read all of it here. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, but you get the idea here. Very long and brutal war. And of course, as you saw some of the titles, you know, the war to end all wars, the Great War, there wasn't any intention of having a second world war after that. They thought, you know, they had, you know, maybe seen the worst of war early on in the 20th century. So anyway, getting to our third question here. Christiana, you want to take number 3 for us?
Okay. Number 3. Which of the following was the most responsible for turning the the conflict that started World War One into a World War. A. Nationalism in Australia. Is it
Austria-Hungary.
Austria-Hungary. B. Extensive alliance formed among nations. C. Despots in Asia. D. An armies race among European nations. I think it's B.
Yes, yeah, B, the alliances forming among nations. Some of the other stuff did have a role, especially like an arms race. A lot of new technology was being put into, weapons of war. But B is in boy for number 3. Okay, and then see, it's same text here. For number 4, Grace, would you like to take number 4?
Okay. How many months elapsed between the assassination of Ferdinand until the signing of the Treaty of
Versailles.
C, 60 months.
Yep, 60 months, right? We see that real clearly on the timeline. So June 28th, 1914 to June 28th, 1919. All right, that's 5 years, 12 times 5, 60, a little math in your social studies class today. So yeah, 60, C as in cat for number 4. Etta, would you like to do number 5 here for us?
Okay, number 5 reads question. Hold on, I gotta scroll down a little bit more. The rivalry between which two nations became an important cause of World War I? A, Britain and Germany. B, Serbia and Germany. C, Russia and Austria-Hungary. Or D, the United States and France. Let me see. Is it Austria and Hungary? No.
So up in our second paragraph there, I'll point out a sentence there. It says Britain was determined to keep its colonial territories and feared that unless it entered the war, its rival Germany would control Western Europe. So A, Britain and Germany. Britain was still, that huge empire, the big sea power, but Germany had come a long way as far as, starting to colonize parts of Africa and everything. So they were a little concerned about the rise of Germany in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So Britain, very concerned about continuing to be, the superpower of the time, the world power in control. And they looked at Germany as a threat. So yeah, part of the rivalry there, A, Britain and Germany is, a big part of World War I. Okay, let's see. Tracy, would you like to do number 6 for us?
Yes. Number 6, which event listed below preceded on of the orders? A. Turkish forces collapse at Megiddo. B. Battle of Marne begins. C. British tanks win at Cambrai. D. End of the Brussels offensive. Okay. I think I can see. Pretty.
This one's tough, right? Because there's so much information on this little timeline.
Yeah. Okay, for a minute. Mm,
So I'll help you out here.
Yeah.
It's a lot to look at. So it's B, the Battle of Marne begins. And so I'll point that out. It's up here. It's one of the first battles. It's actually the first battle right here on September 6th in 1914. And you know, everything else, if you look, you'll find those other events down through here, you know, like the Turkish forces collapse at Megiddo. That's not until 1918. British tanks at Cambrai win in 1917, and the Brusilov offensive. Well, let's see. I'm going to. Oh, yep. That's in 1916. So B, boy, for number 6. Okay, and now we have moving into the post-World War era. So the next timeline illustrates the events that led to Adolf Hitler's rise to Chancellor of Germany. The trend in this timeline connects Germany's loss in World War I to Hitler's role in the Nazi Party, to economic depression and political dissatisfaction, and to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. So after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, it's sort of like that binding document for the treaty to end the war, basically blames Germany, which is kind of funny because it was Austria-Hungary that was the first to declare war. But they were blamed. There was they owed a bunch of reparations. They had to pay a bunch of money. They were humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, getting blamed for it. The rest of the world really came down hard on Germany, in particular, for that war. So what we see over time then is this is a big event that helps the rise of Hitler. So on our timeline, right, we have 1918, World War I ends. 1919, Treaty of Versailles imposes harsh penalties on Germany for its role in the war. This was your fault, Germany. You got to pay up. They were demilitarized. They basically had to give up their arms. They gave up territory. They weren't supposed to be allowed to rearm. You know, just to have like a defense force, but you know, they couldn't really build up a big military. And in 1921, Adolf Hitler becomes leader of the Nazi Party in Germany. Still a small group. You know, it's you know, a fledgling group here. 1923, Hitler leads a failed attempt to overthrow the German government. This is called the Beer Hall Putsch. And it's they tried to take over the German Weimar Republic, like the basically like their parliament, sort of like the January 6th insurrection, right? There's a bunch of dudes and they show up at the government building and try to take it over. Except, you know, it was real Nazis then, not the Walmart Nazis that we have today. And so 1923, Hitler, you know, and he goes to jail. He goes to prison for being involved in that. There were several deaths, but the German, I guess you call them police at the time, were able to, you know, prevent them from overtaking the government. A bunch of people got locked up, including Hitler. So he gets out of prison. By 1925, he's starting to build the Nazi Party. It's actually becoming, you know, it's getting traction. It's growing. The ideas behind Nazism is growing and taking hold between 1925 and 1930. Big important point here. 1929, the Great Depression. The Great Depression reaches Germany. leading to dissatisfaction with other political parties. So they were displeased with the current government. The Great Depression, of course, we know it, in the United States as a huge event that affected, a lot of people. It was global. It was a global depression, and probably it hit Germany harder than any other country in the world. Things just were crazy. Inflation was what they call hyperinflation. The Weimar Republic, the government before the Nazi Socialist Party, were printing $20 million Deutschmarks. So that's the level of inflation. You would go around. It's like, how much is that apple? It's $30 million. Okay, here's 3, Deutschmarks. That's how bad inflation was. It was outrageous. So there's all this discontent in Germany, and they're looking for a solution. They're looking for a way out. They're looking for people to blame, which are going to be the Jewish population. They're going to blame them for a lot of the monetary issues that are arising in Germany. So then 1932, Nazi candidates received the most votes of any party in German elections. So they take control of the government. And then 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor. And they basically give him all the power in 33. So he becomes the head of state and he is in control. And then, we move into, all the other bad stuff after 1933 when he actually takes control of Germany. Let's see. Christiana, would you like to read question 7 for us?
Okay. Number 7. They said, what directly led to the Nazi Party receiving the most votes in the 1932 German elections? A. German unhappiness with other politicians because of the economic crisis. B. Is it what's the word?
Punitive?
Yeah, punitive actions towards the German by victorious alliance at Versailles. C. The choice of Hitler to lead the Nazi Party. D. The end of World War in 1918. I think is the A.
Yeah, I think Etta put it in the chat for us too. So, A, German unhappiness with other politicians because of the economic crisis, which is, what we talked about there. You have to remember too, Hitler was this incredibly charismatic individual. He could get people to follow him. He got a lot of people to listen to him. He was great. I should say great. He was a very effective orator, right? He was a great speaker. And just by the way, punitive, right? That's punishment, an act of punishment. That's the definition of punitive there. So A for number 7, German. Okay. And let's see, question 8. Etta, would you like to take question 8 for us?
Sure. Based on the timeline alone, for how many years was Hitler the leader of the Nazi Party in Germany before he became Chancellor of Germany? A, 10 years, B, 11 years, C, 12 years, or D, 13 years. And I think it's C, 12 years.
Yep, from 1921, when he becomes leader of the Nazi Party in Germany, right, to 1933. A little more math for us today. So C for number 8. C is in cat. Okay. Let's see here. Sasha Gay, you want to read number 9 for us here, the Neutrality Acts?
Okay. The Neutrality Acts were intended to limit American involvement in future wars. In 1935, the Neutrality Act banned weapons exports to hostile nations and restricted American travel on those on those nation ships. The 1939 Act encouraged support of the Allies and allowed the US to supply goods and arms, but it created product shortages at home. President Franklin D. Roosevelt further eroded neutrality by trading surplus US ships to Britain for access to naval and air bases and providing US military equipment to enemies of Germany and Japan under the Lend Lease Plan. Congress repealed the Neutrality Act in 1941.
All right. So believe it or not, I'll let you in on a little secret here. We used to be isolationists and didn't get involved in other people's affairs. Before World War I, Woodrow Wilson was actually an isolationist. He really didn't want to go into World War I. That's why it took so long for us to get involved. We thought Europe has Europe's affairs. We'll let them fight it out and do what they have to. Once the threat started kind of moving into the Atlantic with the submarine warfare and the threat to American shipping and things like that, is when we finally decided to get involved. Once the war was over, we went back to our old ways. We didn't necessarily, we cared about what's going on in Europe because of, economic reasons and trade, and we certainly had friendships, right? But we weren't going to get involved until it started getting really ugly. And of course, that's what the timeline sort of gets into here. So Roosevelt signs the first Neutrality Act, aimed at keeping the United States out of a European war and prohibiting the export of arms, ammunition, and implements of wars to foreign nations at war. So we weren't even going to really help Britain or France, any of our would have been allies in the past. And then by 1939, and of course, if you think about 1935, we're trying to recover from the Great Depression. So Roosevelt is, we're starting work programs and Social Security, these acts, they're trying to boost the American economy. So the last thing we need to get involved with, so we think, is a war where we're having to, take resources to help try to rebuild our government or our country after the Great Depression and putting that on a war footing. But then by 1939, Germany is starting to be Germany, and they are invading Poland and I think annexing Austria. There's, they're claiming land all over the place. It's very obvious Hitler is going to be a threat. He's building this huge army and threatening Europe at this point. So 1939, when war breaks out in Europe, Great Britain and France declare war on Germany. Then in November, right, just 2 months later, the Neutrality Act of 1939, there's new language there. So now we can supply arms to nations at war, and we call it the Lend Lease Act. And it's this idea that once the war was over, we were going to get those materials back, and we were going to get paid for it, right? But in reality, there wasn't a big monetary transaction. What we really gained was access to bases in Britain and France by loaning them those military goods. And then in 1940, U.S. support of Britain becomes more pronounced after German defeat of France. Once France falls to Germany, things are we start, around the late 30s is when we start building our own military, because it's looking inevitable that we're going to have to get involved in this, that Germany is just way too dangerous. And we have our own issues looking on the Pacific with Japan. So then 1941, U.S. Lend Lease Plan allows Britain to borrow war materials. July 1941, U.S. freezes all Japanese assets held in the States following Japan's conquering of French Indochina. French Indochina being Vietnam. So, now we're looking at an issue on the Pacific side with Japan. Then we're looking at, war in Europe, Germany, and then December 1941. Just had our 80th anniversary, right? December 7th, yesterday, of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Sealed the deal. We have to go to war. So United States declares war on Japan, and then Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. And then of course we're like, oh yeah, Germany, well, we declare war on you. Yeah, so again, it's less convoluted than World War I, but you can see where these alliances and everything kind of drag people in. Japan at the time was making this empire, and we had this, what led to the attack on Pearl Harbor is that we had this big naval buildup in Hawaii, right? We had all these warships. Japan felt threatened by that. So that's what wound up, with this basically like a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. They were stretched to the max to get to Hawaii and do what they did and attack Pearl Harbor. But they thought doing that would keep us out of the war. That was the mindset. Of course, we know differently. Anyway, so there's your World War II history lesson for now. Let's see, Etta, what's number 9? Yeah, we're on number 9. You want to read number 9 for us?
When did the Lend Lease plan take effect? A, August 1935, B, June 1940, C, March 1941, or D, December 1941. And I got C, March 1941.
There you go. Yeah, C as in cat, March 1941. Let's see here. Tracy, would you like to take number 10 for us?
Yes. Why did President Roosevelt introduce the Neutrality Act of 1939? A, the isolationist movement were growing stronger. B, supply in arms to Allied help the U.S. economy. C, Roosevelt did not run for re-election. D, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. 1993 and 1939.
I think Ed is putting in B in the chat here. So yeah, supplying arms to allies helped the U.S. economy. So why did President Roosevelt introduce the Neutrality Act? As it turned out, by having them before the Lend Lease Act, they were actually buying American military goods. So yeah, right here, Neutrality Act of 39 allows U.S. to supply arms to nations at war.
Yes, and I already to see the evidence on the patches.
Yeah, so B, B supplying arms. B as in boy for 10. And then one final timeline here to finish out. World War II in Europe and U.S. involvement in the Pacific. So this one gets pretty crazy. We have things happening. Basically, on the top side of the timeline is our involvement in Europe, and then on the bottom we see our involvement in the Pacific, starting with the Germany invading Poland and basically launching into World War II. That's basically the start of what we consider the start of World War II in September 39, and then with Japan responding to a U.S. protest of Japanese aggression in Asia, launching air attacks on U.S. naval forces at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 1941. That's where we start. And then our last event on the 1945 side is Japan formally surrendering on September 2nd. That's following our use of the 2 atomic weapons dropping them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. So that's our involvement. I won't go through every little bit here. We'll get to it as we answer. So I'll go ahead and we'll finish this. I'll help finish this out here. So number 11, which of the following gives the dates of parallel events in Europe and the Pacific, respectively? And if we look, is it A, September 1939, and February 1942, B, May 1945 and September 1945, C, December 1941 and June 1942, or D, April 1945 and August 1945. And if we look here,
See?
it's B. B is in boy.
Okay.
So May 1945, right? German surrenders. And then September 1945, Japan surrenders. So that's what they're looking for in parallel events, right?
Yeah, that's
Parallel.
where I was confused. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, this kind of ticks me off because you're thinking about something that's going to, when you think parallel, you're thinking of something that goes like this, right?
Yeah, that's what I was like.
And you're looking for dates that line up or something, but what they're
Yeah.
really talking about is, parallel events being that, Germany surrenders, Japan surrenders. So, that it's kind of confusing the way they have it worded and what they're looking for, because you're looking here, it's like, well, that's not parallel. No matter how you slice it, those dates are different. But that's what I finally figured out. What they were looking for is similar events happening. So when you have May 1945 and September 1945, those are two surrendering dates, right? So yeah, B is in boy for number 11. And honestly, I think there's another one here that absolutely blows my mind because it's just infuriating. So, okay, number 12, which event on the timeline, this is it, eventually led to the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? So is it A, the success of the D-Day invasion, B, the Battle of Midway, C, the launch of the Manhattan Project, or D, Hitler's death?
I don't know. I'm confused.
Yeah, you know why? Because it's not on the timeline. They don't
I
put
just
it in
see
here.
that dropping of the bomb. I see that at August 1945, and I'm trying to look up, and I'm like, I don't see anything before that. So
Right.
I don't-
There's nothing. So the answer is C, the launch of the Manhattan Project. Okay. Now, please, I looked over this, like 3 different times, and I cannot find that on the timeline. If you see it on the timeline, please tell me, because I did not see that on the timeline anywhere. But yeah, so for 12, it's C as in cat. And of course, the Manhattan Project was the development of the atomic bomb. And I forget which year it started. I should know this. But it was a joint effort between us and Britain. And we had, it was thousands of people. We always, if you hear anything mentioned about the Manhattan Project and dudes working on the atomic bomb, it's always like 3 guys in a lab somewhere. But it was a whole bunch of people. It was this top secret project. And, they eventually moved out to, the desert in New Mexico to start testing. And, but that, that's what led to, of course, the dropping of the atomic bombs. We had to make them first and figure out how they work. So C, the launch of the Manhattan Project for number 12. But just sometimes Paxson just makes me scratch my head. I don't know what they're thinking. Okay, and then 13, based on the information in the timeline, which of the following statements is true? A, the Battle of Midway forced Japan to surrender. B, Germany controlled the Soviet Union. C, Japan joined the war in defense of Germany. Or D, the U.S. Navy was vital in the war against Japan.
A.
A, the Battle of Midway forced Japan to surrender. So C, Japan joined the, oh, I'm sorry, no, D, the US Navy was vital in the war against Japan. Of course, it was the bombs, right? It was the more or less. Again, I could talk like hours about that, but we see that the dropping of the atomic weapons is what led to the surrender of Japan. But D as in dog here, the U.S. Navy was vital in the war against Japan because in the Pacific, it was all island hopping, and it was the theater for the Marines a lot. Of course, there was Army involved too, but that's what we were doing was reclaiming, or we were taking the islands that Japan had conquered, so to speak, as we made our way closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. So D, the U.S. Navy was vital in the war against Japan. D is in dog. And then wrapping it up here for 14, the timeline supports which of the following trends? A, D-Day was the first major turning point in the war. B, the Allies attacked territories that Japan and Germany controlled before directly attacking each other. C, the United States focused all of its attention in 1945 in the Pacific. Or D, Japan had a superior air force.
Is it B?
Yeah, B as in boy. The Allies attacked territories that Japan and Germany controlled before directly attacking each country. So we had to, make our way to, Germany and Japan before we could actually attack them. And, a lot of people, you might wonder, it's like, well, it seems like Japan was really more of a threat to the United States, which is why we, because they attacked us first and everything, but we had such a commitment in Europe. And the prevailing thought there was we had to help our allies so that they could help us. So we put a lot of effort early into fighting the war in Europe. That's why we, D-Day comes before, a lot of other events there. We needed to help our allies deal with Germany so that they in turn could deal with, help us deal with Japan. The closer we get to defeating Japan, though, we realize that we didn't want, of course, the main allies there, the big three fighting, the allies were Britain, United States, and the Soviet Union. The closer we get to defeating Japan, we realize we might not want the Soviet Union that involved with defeating Japan because we don't really want their presence there. We're not really sure what their intentions are going to be after the war. There's already a little concern about what the Soviet Union is going to do once the war's over. So that was also another push to get the atomic weapons finished so we could defeat Japan before we actually needed the Soviet Union to help us defeat Japan. So a little more history for you there. Okay, so submitting my answers, we'll run through them real quick here. One is D as in dog. 2, B as in boy. 3, B as in boy. 4, C as in cat. 5 is A. 6, B as in boy. 7 is A. 8 is C as in cat. 9, C as in cat. 10 is B as in boy. 11, B as in boy. 12, C as in cat. 13, D as in dog. 14, B as in boy. Okay. And just to follow up here, this is one of those, a lot of history going on, a lot of information coming at you. So tomorrow,